One of the interesting things that is coming out of the COVID inquiry is just actually how much the government decided to just completely ignore, which they knew was fully on the way. They could see the potential problems for. But at the time, of course, this was, remember, Boris Johnson's government. Let's get Brexit done because, well, I'm fed up of talking about Brexit, and I want to try and continue the revolution and push forward on for this incredibly hard Brexit. Which, if people had actually maybe had the chance to vote for in a referendum, or heaven forbid a second confirmatory referendum, it would have never have passed. That we know for certain, and we are finding out that all this prep for Brexit was absolutely destroying any preparation of any kind for the impending pandemic, which they knew was on the way. And if you again rewind your memories all the way back to certainly the end of 2019, and of course the start of 2020, there were people saying, even the EU said, "Hey, UK," or, "Hey, government, Boris Johnson, we know there's this big pandemic on the way. It looks like it's going to be pretty serious. Are you sure at this moment in time you want to continue with Brexit? Because that is going to be a colossal challenge in itself, and you're going to have to deal with Brexit at the same time as this. Are you sure you want to, not put it on hold for a year just to, see how the pandemic works out, or wait and see what happens?" Of course, no. We were pushed along by these hardcore Brexit zealots who pushed for the hardest Brexit possible, even though during the Brexit referendum, and of course the Leave campaign campaigned on a platform which was for a very, very soft Brexit, which again, because Leave did not try to visualize what Brexit was, it created a very amorphous blob of what Brexit was. So it could be anything to anyone, because they needed it to be as wide as people as possible to attract as many people as they could. This is why you can still see Leave campaign literature, videos, of course, the infamous quote from Daniel Hannan we quote all the time about them staying in the single market and customs union. And of course, now the more we go through this COVID inquiry, the more we are finding out just how much Brexit screwed up our response to the pandemic. And today we're going to go over Northern Ireland, because this seems to have been really hard on Northern Ireland, that their preparedness, as we are about to find out, they had to completely cannibalize departments before the pandemic hit. And this affected their response to the pandemic. So we're going to go over this today, because I think this is really important, to be honest, to cover the fact that, we were calling at the time for a pause on Brexit to deal with COVID, and yet we were completely ignored on this. And again, looks like we were proved right. So, as always, before we go diving into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. So, on with this. This comes from Open Democracy with the title of "Brexit Prep Forced Northern Ireland to Cannibalise Departments Before COVID." Preparing for a no-deal Brexit, because at the time that was potentially still on the cards, if you may remember, forced the Northern Ireland government to cannibalise departments, a senior civil servant has said. Speaking during the COVID-19 inquiry on Thursday, Denis McMahon, the permanent secretary for the Northern Irish Executive, explained how the unique political impact of Brexit to Northern Ireland, which shares a land border with the EU, took up large amounts of the civil service focus and diverted it from emergency planning. "We had to cannibalise departments in order to move people out of areas of work and into preparations for an EU exit," McMahon told the inquiry. Talking about the decisions to leave the EU, McMahon said that "we had a situation where we had this uniquely contentious political situation to deal with without ministers. Unlike other parts of the UK that were getting where we were preparing for the potential impacts of new border agreements. Talking about whether Northern Ireland was prepared for a pandemic, McMahon stressed that this wasn't an excuse, but it was the context which was necessary to explain the effects on the administration. Which, again, fair enough. He said, "We were genuinely scared of the consequences of a no-deal exit," he said. And rightly so, because if that no-deal Brexit happened, at the time, there was every chance that there would be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And everyone in Northern Ireland, and if you know the context and the history of Northern Ireland and what's going on there, that if you drop a hard border, we all know what would happen. So, he said, this redistribution of resources has also compounded a staffing issue, where the Northern Ireland saw a large drop in the number of civil servants it employed. But McMahon also argued that Operation Yellowhammer, a cross-government plan to prepare for a no-deal Brexit, had the benefits for pandemic planning. Whatever the view of inquiry, as it was how we performed, it would have been immeasurably worse without Operation Yellowhammer, he said. Other civil servants and politicians have mentioned the effect that preparations of a no-deal Brexit had on the emergency planning during the first module of the COVID-19 inquiry. And Catherine Hammond, the former director of the Civil Servants Contingency Secretariat and the Cabinet Office, said that Operation Yellowhammer was a major consumer of resources in her time there. The Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, defended the preparations for a no-deal Brexit, telling the inquiry it was worth remembering the kinds of frank apocalyptic warnings that we were being delivered about the consequences of a no-deal Brexit. For example, in relation to medical supplies, adding that it was appropriate that we shift from the resilience function to deal with this. And this is just ultimately high. That is an interesting admission from Oliver Dowden there, because during this time, conservatives such as Oliver Dowden were downplaying the fact of Operation Yellowhammer, trying to downplay the effects of a no-deal Brexit, that a no-deal Brexit was perfectly fine, that it would have no effects on the UK, that it would be no problems. Yet here you have a Conservative minister admitting that a no-deal Brexit would have been incredibly damaging for the UK, completely contradicting everything that Brexiteers, Leavers, and even the Conservative Party at that time were saying about what a no-deal Brexit would mean. So the inquiry also heard and was heard from McNom, acknowledged that the emergency planning for the documents in Northern Ireland were woefully out of date and even barely mentioned pandemic risk, and the majority had not been updated since 2016, with one dating all the way back to March of 2002. So this just goes back to really reaffirming what we were all saying at that time. We all saw, even myself, I've got videos of me talking about this back at the time, at the early start of 2020 and end of 2019, saying, yeah, there's this massive pandemic on its way. Looks like it could be actually pretty serious. Maybe we should put Brexit on hold for a time being, just to make sure, and it does look like more and more we're hearing through this inquiry that the planning for Brexit took up any potential planning, or at least contingency planning and emergency planning for, for the potential pandemic that was clearly on its way. And yet, I will say this now, that is an interesting admission from Oliver Dowden. The fact that he's clearly said that, yeah, there were all these very dire warnings about what a no-deal Brexit would mean, and yet look back at what the Conservative Party was saying in 2019, that a no-deal Brexit would be no problem, that it wouldn't be an issue, that it was all going to be fine. This was all just scaremongering. This was all just part of Project Fear. And yet here you have someone who was, again, a Conservative minister part of his party actively trying to get across the message that a no-deal Brexit would be perfectly fine, there would be no damages. That, to be honest, in itself is a very interesting admission. But the inquiry continues, and I'm really glad that we're having a look at this period and the preparedness of the UK for a pandemic, because it's really pointing out just how, again, the Conservatives failed to do any preparedness planning for any types of this. And then, even when they could see that this was on its way, they would far rather prepare for something that they could put the brakes on and pause to deal with the pandemic, but instead they chose not to. So it just shows you what the government priorities were at the time. But of course, as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, please do remember to click on that like and share button on your way out. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.